So here we are in Microsoft Flight Simulator again to look at another new add-on aeroplane for the simulator. This became available on Sim Market today. I'll put a link in the description below as to where you can get this thing, and more on the developer in a moment. But what we've got is this thing that you can see in front of you, which is the Bede BD 5J, which you may or may not be familiar with. When we get this thing in the air, I'll talk about the real thing. But first a bit about the developer, and then we'll look at it, and then we'll get it flying. So the developer of this thing is AzurPoly, who, as I understand it, is a French developer. They've made a couple of add-on airports for Microsoft Flight Simulator, but as far as I'm aware, this is their first stab at making an aeroplane, and a very nice job they've done of it too. Bear in mind that the real aeroplane, the BD 5J, is a kit plane, so it has that look to it. So if you're looking at it and thinking, well, it looks a bit utilitarian, the real thing looks like that because it's intended to be built at home by builders in their garage off a kit. But it's very, very nicely modelled. It's got that kind of polished metal look, and the add-on is €13.80, so roughly about a tenner, so not very expensive at all. Before that, you get the jet plane, you get about 5 different paint jobs with the thing, and you get a PDF manual. The PDF manual is short but sweet. It runs through about 2 pages, but it's got all the information necessary to fly this plane because it is a very simple plane. So it's got all of the V speeds that you need, and flap speeds and approach speeds and all that kind of stuff. Now, let's have a look inside at the thing. So, we have a canopy that operates like that. So down goes the canopy. I'll do that on the external view because Microsoft Flight Simulator has that kind of weird lag when you close the canopy. You can see that this thing's very nicely modelled on the inside. It's definitely got that kit plane look, i.e. pop rivets on the floor for the metal panelling and all that kind of stuff. And nearly all of these controls actually work, and the ones that don't work are ones that you wouldn't really worry about too much. So let's take a look at it. So we can see that the canopy works. The controls are animated. This thing, despite its space rocket looks, has conventional controls. It has elevators. It's an all-flying tailplane, rudder, ailerons, and there are flaps, which are 2 stages of flaps. 15 degrees for takeoff, although, you know, if you've got a long enough runway, you could take off without flaps, and 30 degrees for landing. So 2-stage flaps. So let's take a look at the controls. So we have our throttle control. This is a jet plane. We have an elevator trim. We have a fuel cut-off switch. If it is vertical, the fuel is turned off. If it's horizontal, where it is now, it's on. So pretty simple. There is a non-functioning smoke oil air show display switch there. It's about the only switch that doesn't work. We have an ignition switch, a master battery switch, an avionics switch, and there is a start button, which I will hit in a moment. In the middle, we have a gear lever there, and we have a flap switch there. And as I say, there are 2 stages of flaps. There is a slight glitch on this. I'll get to it when we get in the air. It's not an insurmountable problem, and I'll tell you how to get around it. So don't worry about that too much. Non-functioning circuit breaker switch is there. This panel, everything works on it. So we've got a fuel pump switch there. We've got a fuel selector switch there. Manual selection for the tanks. If we have a look at the tanks, you can see this thing has 2 tanks, but you will have to be careful when you're flying it around to occasionally switch those tanks. Otherwise, you will get an imbalance on the fuel. 3 lights there, nav lights, strobe lights, and cabin lights. So you can, even though this is intended to be a sort of VFR fun jet, you can fly this thing at night because it has night lighting on it, like that, and exterior lighting on it. So there are strobes and there are nav lights on the wingtip. So even though this thing isn't really intended to be flown at night, you can fly it at night in the sim if you want to. Nothing to stop you doing that. I'll put that back on there, and we don't really need the lights on, so we'll turn those off just to save the battery a little bit. Fairly basic panel. Bear in mind that this thing dates from the 70s and 80s, so no glass avionics on the thing. Airspeed indicator with things starting to get dangerous at 220 knots and bits starting to fall off at about 250, 260 knots. So pretty fast, but, you know, not a rocket ship despite the looks. Altimeter, which you can adjust. It's reading us a little bit high because we are at Liverpool John Lennon Airport, a little bit above sea level, next to the Mersey estuary. Turn and slip indicator, vertical speed indicator, whiskey compass, G meter, which you can reset if you want to, oil gauge there, engine RPM gauge for the jet engine, or exhaust gas temperature, which you need to watch because it's a jet engine, fuel flow there, fuel gauge, pretty simple radio, and transponder, so you could take this thing on VATSIM if you wanted to. That's about the size of it, and as I say, the only thing that doesn't function in here is the circuit breakers and that smoke oil switch, and I don't know, maybe they'll patch that and have those working. Certainly, you know, it could do with the smoke all working, because these things in real life were very, very popular at air shows. So let's get this thing cranked up and let's fly it about, and then we'll talk about the real aeroplane a little bit. So, engine start button, if you've got the ignition on, you're hitting that thing, you make sure that the fuel flow's on, and you make sure that the ignition's on the thing, and it starts cranking up. The real thing has a Semel TRS-18 jet engine, which is a tiny little jet engine. The engine actually only weighs 37 kilograms on this thing, and this engine appears on a few planes, including one that I reviewed the other day on my channel, which is the Caproni C22. That has two of the same engine in it. If you've not seen that review, that's a really, really fun jet. It's on my channel. Take a look at that. So there we go. The thing is starting up, and we can see there the RPMs kicking up and what have you, and the fuel flow and all that kind of stuff. So no problem with the instruments or anything like that. Now, because the engine is stable, we can turn the fuel pump off, and you know, we could, I suppose, turn the ignition off, but I'm not sure whether that would be a great idea. I don't know whether this engine is self-sustaining with the ignition off. Let's not chance it, eh? There's not much wind here, and it seems to be straight down the runway at 2 knots, so we could take off downwind if we wanted to. If you look very carefully there, you will see that there is a plane flying about. So I have my sim with all the details turned up, photogrammetry on. I'm at one of the souped-up airports, which is Liverpool John Lennon Airport, and I've got, as you can see, AI planes flying around, and this is having no problems with frame rates. I have my sim locked at 30 frames per second, and you can see there, up if you look at top left, it is cheerfully hitting that, no problem. So if you like planes that get very, very good frame rates, then this is certainly one of them. So let's go on the external view. Let's give it a bit of thrust. Now, I don't actually recommend taxiing this thing over the grass, but for the purposes of brevity, we will do. I will turn it with my rudder pedals there, and we'll get this thing out. Now, while we're on the external view, conventional rudder controls, very, very sensitive. All flying tailplane with an elevator trim and standard ailerons on there, so nothing fancy about this in terms of controls. It will get off the deck at about 80, 85 knots, depending on your flap setting. I am going to take off with 1 stage of flaps on this thing. With it being a jet rather than a prop plane, there isn't going to be much torque when we're on the runway, so it should track fairly straight, and that's just as well, really, because you can see that this thing is very, very sensitive on the rudders. So I recommend getting this thing lined up pretty well on the runway, and it should track fairly straight. It doesn't need a massive amount of runway, but with it being so low down to the ground, when you bring it in for a landing, you're going to get a lot of ground effect float on this thing. So you know, don't come in too high and fast, otherwise you might end up using more runway than you would actually prefer. So there we go, I've got this thing lined up. We're pretty well lined up there, so I'll open up the throttle. Now, despite its rocket ship looks, it has not got the most powerful jet engine in the world. So, you know, it's not going to accelerate like an F-16, but, you know, it's getting up there pretty quick. And we're now at a point where we can lift the thing into the air. So, you know, you can see it doesn't use a great deal of runway. I'll go on the external view, I'll get the gear up. The gear up comes up pretty quick, and we'll get the flaps up, and away we go. Now, about that glitch. Now, normally when I buy a flight simulator aeroplane, and I did buy this one, it's not a freebie, so as I say, it was €13.80, which is pretty cheap. Now, normally when I buy one, what I do is I load it up in the sim at an airport, and I have it start on the ramp with the engine stopped. And when I did that with this thing, sure enough, it loaded into the sim, but it loaded into the sim with a glitch on the gear. The gear was retracted, so it was sat on its wings. In fact, I think one gear was down, one of the main gear. And I thought, oh, well, no problem, hit the G key to lower the gear, and that should sort it out. But it didn't. So I'm thinking, what am I going to do? So what I did was I loaded it into the sim with it on the runway with the engines running. That solved the problem. And for the purposes of this review, what I did then was I taxied it to the ramp, shut the engines down. So when you saw that thing on the ramp shut down, that's how I'd done it. Yeah, so not an insurmountable problem, and I'm sure the developer will look at it. Developer is AzurPoly, as I say, will look at it. But if they don't sort that problem out, you can sort it out yourself by starting it on the runway, taxiing it to the ramp, shutting the engine down, and then you could even save the file if you wanted to. Now, you can see that this thing, it's not a rocket ship. I mean, it is quite fast, but, you know, it's going to take a while to get up to sort of 220 knots. But it is very aerobatic and very maneuverable, and I will demonstrate that. I will go on the external view. I'll just zoom out a bit and I'll show you what the roll rate's like on this thing, because it's got a hell of a roll rate. Here we go. Full left aileron deflection. That's pretty wild, that, yeah. I'll get the nose down a little bit so the speed starts building, and we'll do a loop on the thing. So there we go. We're up to 195. We're getting near to that sort of do not exceed speed, so I'll do the entry into a climb. Now, I'm not. It will give me a warning if I'm over pitching it. But you can see 100 and it's just dropping to about 80 as it comes over. Oh, the plane flew past there. See that? So, yeah. You can loop this thing and throw it about and what have you. And there is a G meter on the thing. So, you know, like, you can keep an eye on that if you don't want to overstress the thing. So, yeah, fun. You can throw it about. And it's got a hell of a roll rate. So, a little bit about the real aeroplane. So, the real aeroplane was designed by a very, very well-known aircraft designer from the United States who worked for, I think he worked for North American. And that's a guy called Jim Bede, which is why this is the BD5J. And he designed a few home-built kit aeroplanes, which is why this is the BD5. And when he announced it in the late 1960s, early 70s, people went mad for it because it was going to be, excuse me, it was going to be a home-built kit for about $2,000 that looked like that and was a jet plane. Although he did do the BD5 not J model that was you could install a pusher prop into and what have you. So loads of people were like, yeah, take my money, and giving him $800 deposits. Some people paid the full price deposit for it, which was about $2,000 to get hold of this thing. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but bear in mind that this was the 70s, yeah, and for about $2,000 in the 70s, you could buy a brand new Volkswagen Beetle and for around about that kind of money. So yeah, $2,000 isn't quite as cheap as it sounds in today's money. But what happened was he took about 5,000 orders for the thing, which equates to about $7 million, and that was with the intention of creating all the tooling to build the kits and stuff like that. But owing to not being particularly brilliant at financial management and having to get help in and stuff like that, things went a bit horribly wrong. Including the engine that he decided to use for the thing. There were problems with the company that made the engine and stuff like that. And so the thing ran into difficulties, and eventually the company closed with him delivering a lot of kits, but he'd had to deliver a lot of the kits without engines. Now, that led to some notorious problems, and it's why some people think, you know, Jim Bede is a bit of a legend, whereas some people think he's a bit of a charlatan, because he had all of those people's $7 million, and when the company closed down, then he started up again and started designing other aircraft and what have you. So he wasn't popular with everyone, but he was certainly a very creative guy. He was basically a very, very fast talker. As he described it himself, he said, I can talk at about 100 words a minute with occasional gusts of 150. So he was kind of very, very engaging character and what have you. And I think that's what enabled him to convince a lot of people to give him deposits for this thing. So even though about 5,000 the kits were delivered and he took about 10,000 orders, there only about 200 or so of these things were ever built. And part of the problem with it was that some people were building it and they weren't getting the engine that was intended to be delivered with it. So what they were doing was they were putting different engines in the thing, and that led to some imbalance problems. Some people fitted engines that were not ideal for the thing. They maybe didn't fit them properly. And there is, of course, the issue with build quality. When people are building things themselves at home, they might not necessarily build it that well. So a lot of these things crashed, and I mean a lot. Lots of famous airshow pilots were killed in these things because it was incredibly popular at airshows. Several companies such as Budweiser and Pepsi and all that lot have had these things at the air displays and stuff like that, and they were incredibly popular at air displays. But there is a horrendous statistic about the BD5, which is 15% of all flights of the BD5 have ended up with a fatality. Now that's a horrendous statistic, but as I say, a lot of that is due to home built issues and stuff like that. So you don't have to worry about that in the sim. This thing actually flies quite nicely and is relatively easy to fly. But that says a lot about the thing. So anyway, you would have seen this thing at air shows in the 70s and 80s and what have you, and Oshkosh. But it had when they were developing the prototype, it had some sort of like famous crash landings and stuff like that. But what it's perhaps most famous for is if you've seen the James Bond film Octopussy, starring Roger Moore. And in the opening sequence of that, Roger Moore makes an escape and gets into one of these things and taxis it out of a horse box that's towing it. Somewhat unrealistically, he has the wings fold down on his in the movie, and he avoids a surface-to-air missile, and then the thing runs out of fuel, and he does a dead stick landing on the thing and rolls up to a petrol station, and there's a hillbilly at the petrol station who looks at him in amazement, and he does in his inimitable Roger style, fill her up. Cue Bond theme, Octopussy. So that made this thing really, really famous and what have you. So yeah, it's a very, very, very fun aeroplane. So you can see there, if you look at the airspeed indicator, that I'm doing about 105 knots. So that's more than safe enough to put the flaps down. So I'll go 2 stages of flaps and I'll get the gear down on the thing. So no problem with the gear once it's in the air. So despite that slight glitch that you can get on starting the flight, if you can start it on the runway and then taxi it to the ramp and shut it down, that'll solve the problem. And no problems with it in the air. And it flies very, very nicely. It is very, very, very maneuverable, but at these kind of speeds, it's not like it's twitching about. You can see there that I'm having to give it a lot of stick to sort of get it to roll at lower speeds and what have you. Rudder's still very, very sensitive. This thing should be approaching about 105 knots or something like that, with the speed bleeding off to around about 80, 85 when we get over the runway. It doesn't need a lot of runway, but keep in mind that if you're a little bit high like I am here, that's high as in altitude, not as in substance abuse, it's pretty slick. So, with the nose down, the speed's going to stay on. So you want to get this thing slowed down fairly early so that you're coming over the numbers at about 90, 85 or something like that. And keep in mind what I said before, that it can be a bit deceptive because you're so low to the ground to flare this thing. And when you are low to the ground, it probably will float because it's in ground effect. So you can see there, I'm doing about 88 knots here, which is pretty much on the numbers for what you would be wanting to fly this thing. And I've got the throttle completely back. And I'm just letting this thing float down with the speed bleeding off. So I'm 83, and I'm going to be, when I get sort of over the runway surface, about 80 knots. But you can see, if I go on the external view, even though it looks like we're pretty low, still quite high off the ground there, because it's like a sports car. You're very low to the ground. So you can see there, about 60. And I'm touching down. So yeah, conceivably you could get this down on fairly short runways, because I'm hitting the brakes there. I'm going for this turn off, and I'll give you an idea of how much runway that took. I probably could have got it down in less than that, but it's not really requiring a massive runway to do it. I'm not sure you'd be able to operate it off grass strips. It'd probably be a bit too bumpy, and on the real thing you'd have the possibility of FOD ingestion. But in a sim you can try these things if you want to. So, we don't care about this. We can taxi over the grass if we want to. So yeah, this is a fun thing. Inexpensive, comes down the pipe very, very quickly, installs into the community folder. My installer insisted on unzipping it to a folder, and then I had to manually drag it into my SSD drive where I've got the flight simulator installed, but not a problem. It went straight in there, and as I say, the only issue I found with it is it can load into the sim with the gear retracted if you load it onto the RAM. But an easy solution: start it on the runway, taxi it to the RAM, shut it down, and save your flight. Problem solved. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to start this review like I did. So there you go. Now, those of you that are familiar with my channel will know that I reviewed another little light jet on the channel the other day, which is the Caproni C22 Ventura, which the real thing uses the same engines as this, or engine, because the 22 has two of the engines that this has, whereas this has one. That's the TRS 18, which is made by Turbo Mecha now. Right, I'm gonna shut this thing down. So we'll go there, and we'll turn the ignition off, and we'll put the fuel. I'll turn the avionics off, and I'll hit that. So nice shutdown sound on the thing as well. And the reason that I'm mentioning that is that if you're in the market for just one little fun jet, take a look at my review of that 22 Ventura that I did the other day, because that's very good fun as well. This is one for kind of like your history buffs, because and like people that like it because it's in the Bond film, because it is an absolutely legendary airplane, even for its notoriety. The other one's a little bit less well known, but perhaps a little bit more fun. If you've got the money, I'd recommend both. I think that that given that this is the debut from a developer, I think they've done a fantastic job on it, and that little glitch doesn't really detract from it too much. I hope they sort it out, but as I say, very, very easy to solve. So unlike the real aeroplane and Jim Bede being a bit of a charlatan, there's no hint of that with this thing. So an interesting aeroplane, and a record-breaking aeroplane. There are still about 30 of these things flying, so they are about in the real world, and you do occasionally see them at air shows. And it's record-breaking because it's the lightest jet plane ever built. It weighs only 358 pounds. With all the fuel on board and the pilot on board and stuff like that, the MTOW is a little bit shy of twice that. So it's very, very light, which accounts for the maneuverability of the thing. So it's a fun thing. And as I say, if you've got about €10 going spare, check this out. But if you're looking for something that's an alternative that's a bit speedier, also check out that Ventura that I reviewed. And if you like all this review stuff that I do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to put your comments below the video, because I always like to chat to people about stuff. And if you want to bump into me on forums, you can find me on the main Flight Simulator forum. You can find me on AvSim and Flight Sim and all that kind of stuff. Or as I say, put your comments in below the videos and all this kind of stuff, because I do always respond to them, and I always like to chat to people. It's all very nice, and all that Flight Simulator community, one of the fun things, because we all love airplanes. Anyway, that's it for this one from Chock's Hangar. I got another one coming up later this week, or it might be over the weekend. It depends, because it's my birthday tomorrow, and I'm back in work tomorrow. Got to work on my birthday. I've got another product that I'm getting ready to review. So look out for that. As I say, hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell, and then you'll get email notifications of when there is a new stuff out. But beyond that, minus the channel plug there, everybody take it easy, have fun. That's it for this one. Bye.